So let's talk about assessing those resources, okay? So we've engaged our stakeholders. We have a plan to continue that. We've assembled the team. We've identified our priorities. We have a plan to harness the data. We've captured the data. Now we've bifurcated to consider both infrastructure and inclusion. Let's backtrack to the infrastructure track and let's look at assessing those resources. And you will do the same thing for a digital inclusion track as well. But let's walk through those steps, one by one. And so we're going to assess those resources. And in this assessment, we're going to compare existing resources that exist with community needs and use those results to shape our planning. You can see in this chart here, we're going to conduct an inventory of existing resources and assets. We're going to compare those with and to the community needs assessment. We're going to identify any gaps. And then those results are going to be used in that initial roadmap, the development of that initial roadmap, or the development of those initial planning activities and assumptions. So let's talk about broadband planning inventories, right? There are a number of different ones that you can conduct. For the students, this is part of the work that you'll be doing with Mr. Burns in the community, but you're going to conduct an inventory of physical facilities and community resources. You're going to conduct an inventory of projects and processes that facilitate lower costs for broadband deployment. You're going to conduct a simple inventory of what we call land and space. You're going to conduct an inventory of the service sectors and geographic areas in the community. And then finally, conduct an inventory of personal computer centers and adoption and training programs, again, to aid the digital inclusion programming that's going to take place in the community. So let's go through these one by one. With the inventory of physical facilities and community resources, let's focus in on fiber assets and fiber facilities. I'm not going to read through all of these, but just as an example, you're going to determine, are there any existing private or public sector conduit, right? That is the actual infrastructure that's in the ground that makes it really easy to deploy fiber optic cables and technology, right? I'm going to identify any abandoned gas lines, right? Any existing traffic signal fiber that can be used, right? Any institutional networks, government owned or state owned, right? Are there any existing telecommunications routes with available conduit, right? Many carriers are building excess capacity with fiber that's already constructed. You may be able to lease space in that conduit to make deployment easier, right? Can you utilize railroad routes and railroad right-of-ways? Are there any street light conduit for any smart city deployment? And again, as I talked about, shared conduit with telecommunications providers. That's usually done with some type of fee or arrangement or lease. So again, all of this information is generally readily available. We don't know where to look for it, but we know that it is available. And so that's some of the work that the students will be doing, hopefully in conjunction with the knowledge and skill of those in the community. And I have to talk about this just for a second. Oftentimes we've worked in a number of different communities where, there's usually one person, right? Mr. Fred or Miss Betty, who absolutely knows everything that's going on in the community. They know when everything was constructed. They know where the permits are. They know who are all the contact people, right? We've got to make sure that we engage those people. We need to get that information in the database because as I like to say, if Miss Betty ever hits the lottery, she's gone, and all that institutional knowledge goes with her. So again, whenever we're conducting this inventory, we want to make sure that we're capturing it and that we're documenting it for future use. Right? You're going to conduct a similar inventory for wireless facilities, right? Any water towers that are owned by the city or private entity, right? Water towers can be used to deploy wireless technology. Are there any public or private buildings with rooftop space for wireless antennas, right? Any existing cell towers, right? Street poles, street lights may be used for, 5G or small cell devices. And then easements for new placements of new poles. And that may also be used for small cell deployment, either wireless or 5G deployment if you're in an urban or metropolitan area. Next, we're going to look at those projects and processes that facilitate lower cost broadband deployment. Number one, is there a dig once policy in effect? That means if there's a large, generally a transportation project in effect, can you utilize those open trenches, if you will, to deploy fiber optic conduit? To deploy some other technology, while that construction is going on. That greatly reduces the cost of broadband deployment because instead of incurring all of that construction costs on your own, you can take advantage of an existing construction project or an existing road project where the streets or right of ways are already accessible. Right? You want to ask the question: can I align broadband planning with the schedule and location of other public work projects? Right? That's just common sense. Right? You want to streamline our local permitting processes and understand that those processes of other right-of-way providers, we talked about railroads before, utility or pole owners, we have to understand that because that is both time and money, and that impacts the cost of broadband deployment. Let's talk about inventory of land and space. Right, this is just a simple, review of land and buildings and space that can be either leased or donated to offset the cost of broadband deployment. Right, are there plots of land suitable for a node or a network operations center? Are there inside space of government buildings for hub locations? A lot of government buildings have empty spaces that can be donated or used for telecommunications equipment, for networking equipment. So we need to understand that, right? Some locations already have a network operations center or data center available. Is there space in those facilities that can be used, either leased or donated for an existing project? Are there any existing wireless sites? Generally, with cell sites, with cell towers, they offer co-location, meaning they will allow for more than one project or more than one provider to be able to access those sites for service provision. And then finally, is there space for Wi-Fi access points? You will see this primarily in a lot of urban areas, but for public Wi-Fi and other Wi-Fi for fee services, they actually have to have equipment placed in certain points. And some cities, some jurisdictions make that space available. So again, is there space to deploy and put that equipment up that you don't have to then go out and buy or build for a particular network construction project or network build project? Now let's talk about the service sector and geographic areas in the community. Right, this takes a little bit more of knowledge and skill and ability, a little more collaboration with the local community, particularly the local government. But do they classify business license data by industry codes? Right, someone in the city government, local government will know that. Are there land use plans and circulation elements that exist? Right, you need to understand that. Is there an identification of city, state, and federal facilities? Right, very important. Identification of education buildings and campuses, both at a K through 12 level and institutions of higher education. Right, you need to understand where all your medical facilities are, your hospitals, your clinics, your community facilities, and if any of areas have been designated business improvement districts or tax increment finance districts. Right? Are there any business or industrial parks? Right? So all of this information, again, will build the plan and can offset the cost or make it more attractive for a provider to come in and provide service or provide or build or expand broadband infrastructure. So let's flip and talk about engaging partners, right? We'll do a certain section, a specific section on engaging partnerships and establishing successful partnerships. Right? We want to make sure we're engaging the right people, we're having the right conversations and tone and tenor, and again, that we're bringing the right partners to the table. So the community can choose an implementation strategy based on strengths, weaknesses, and capabilities, right? We talked about this in the one-on-one overview. Number one, we can encourage a provider to extend, build a network, or to provide a service to the community area, the target communities at need. That's working with your existing service provider to expand their existing services, right? Or you can run a network over another provider's network. This is generally done on a wholesale level around a middle mile where you purchase access or connectivity or bandwidth from an existing network. so that you can run your network operations over. Right? You either do that in conjunction with the private partner, or the municipal organization or entity, can decide to do that on its own as well. And then finally, option three, we can decide to build or extend our own network facilities. Again, this generally involves working with a new market entrant, if it's a service provider, or if it's a municipal or institutional network. It involves building or expanding those existing network facilities and assets. Either way, either decision, the communities can identify those potential uses, users, or customers that will ultimately shape the project's implementation. Right? We've talked about this before. Specific uses include, smart agriculture, smart city, smart community uses. If you want to enhance your, utilities, we talk about smart grid. Particularly now in the advent of COVID and COVID-19 pandemic, telemedicine and telehealth, we want to ensure, that those in our population that need, medicine and medical services can get them, even if they can't, physically make it to the doctor's office. And then for users, we want to ensure that our institutions, our businesses, our residents, have the users on the network to be able to support it. So let's talk about evaluating the technological solutions. So again, we're engaging our stakeholders throughout this process. We've assembled a hardworking team. We've identified the priorities. We're harnessing the data. We've considered the correct approach, both on infrastructure and inclusion. We've conducted our resource assessment. We've engaged the right partners. And now it comes time to evaluate and choose that correct technological approach. So in evaluating those technical solutions, you're going to select the technology based on the community's needs. You're going to consider the program's mission and the target audience, right? Generally, it's going to be your unserved or underserved population, but it could be your institutional communities that need that infrastructure, right? So that community needs assessment is very important. If you're on the broadband infrastructure side, you really focus on the deployment technology and establishing those connections, right? Connections to last mile homes and businesses, connection to wholesale sites on your middle mile network, making sure your community anchor institutions are connected to the network. And on the digital inclusion side, it's ensuring that you have the right equipment, that equipment is at the right location, that the training is at a convenient location, that you're selecting the right location in terms of the people who need digital inclusion, access, and equity. So again, the community needs assessment is very important. Ultimately, the community will make the right choice, right? It will select the right technology based on those community characteristics and those needs. And students, we talked about all of this work that you're going to do at the front end will help the community select the right technology. Right, being able to identify those gaps, being able to future-proof and make decisions that are in the best interest of the homes, of the businesses, of the residents, of the needs of that community. Right. In broadband infrastructure, the technology might be a wireless solution or a fiber solution. Could also be satellite. Right. The connections could be last mile, middle mile, or both. Right. So again, all of this information that you are going to help them gather will impact those decisions. And no approach is the wrong approach. And the more information that you get, the better information you'll have to make a decision. And then finally, you want to select the right organization model for the project implementation. We talked about this, we'll talk about this, in our business plans module, but you will select an organization model that's based on those project benefits, right? Any legal relationships, the identification of the funding sources that will be used, right? The assets that will be owned and the expertise that will be needed, right? Government models, usually in what we call partnership models, vary along this continuum, right? Purely government-owned, government-led, and municipal ownership, that's the pure government-owned model. All the way through a private sector-owned or private sector-led model. That's generally the service provider going about their own business. And then the traditional P3 models are in between, right? Public-private partnerships, right? Some type of nonprofit owned and led activity. Cooperative, you see a lot of co-ops now in the utility space. and then there are some that are just pure utility owned and led provision of broadband infrastructure and services. So, from our work and expertise, we understand that public private partnerships, or P3s, can bring funding and expertise to a potential deployment project that's really needs it, right? So, you have to consider what your community hopes to gain from a partner. So, for the community members in the audience, these questions are for you, right? When evaluating a particular private partner to bring to the table or to the project, right, do they fill a specific need or expertise? Can they build project support by reaching new stakeholders? Maybe they bring an entirely new stakeholder to the table. Uh, do they have access to additional capital or funding sources? It's very important. And you also want to identify potential partners that would increase or expand cost sharing models, right? Revenue potential, expertise and support, and institutional collaboration, right? So we have to make sure that we're bringing the right partners, to the table in terms of both minimizing risk, and maximizing benefits. And so the community, I really want you to consider the resources, the capabilities. Again, I talked about risk mitigation and risk tolerance when evaluating a potential partner to bring to the table. There's some benefits of some P3 models. The private sector led, that's generally the commercial operator, the service provider. It can build and own and operates its own network, right? Community institutions can offer planning, they can offer monetary support and regulatory support. Regulatory support in terms of streamlined processes, right? Reduce costs and times to make decisions on projects, right? Government-led models that are government-led but private sector supported. You'll see a lot of these as well. The public entity will own the network, but the private partner will actually construct, operate, and or maintain the network in exchange for some type of financial or in-kind arrangement or support. So the government leads it, but the private will operate it and service all of the end user customers. And then there's a joint ownership model where the operator and the public enterprise jointly invest in the network and they share capacity. They share both risk, they share both benefits, and they share capacity on the network. The network management can be determined by agreement. Right? Generally, this joint ownership model will be governed by a partnership agreement that will spell out the various roles and responsibilities of each entity.